Did you know that today is actually a really important day in the NFL offseason calendar, at least for the Chicago Bears and a handful of other teams that have taken advantage of it?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, wherever you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, you name it. The podcast is anywhere you can find it, free and available on all platforms. Thanks for making us your first listen, hopefully each and every day. On the show today, we get into the June 1st deadline, this June 1st turnover date, the June 1st designation that the Chicago Bears have utilized that will automatically free up some new salary cap space for them tonight, starting then tomorrow, post June 1st. We'll get into how the whole June 1st rule works and how that sort of changed in 2006 and how it sort of set the Bears now with an extra $7.2 million in cap space coming officially, I guess, starting tomorrow after the June 1st turnover date, and kind of how that has worked with Tarik, Cohen, and Trevathan's contracts in particular. We'll wrap up with a look at some of the other players that could become available for the Bears now, either in free agency or potentially via a trade, now that we are going to be post June 1st, that other teams might be looking to make moves now that the books and the salary cap money is changed a little bit here and there. I will say you might be able to hear a slight difference in my voice. I pretty well lost my voice over this long Memorial Day weekend, and it's not quite 100% back. So I apologize if I don't sound quite as clear and as great as I normally do, but trust me, this is a lot better than my voice has been the last 48 or 72 hours. So we're rolling through here, and it's an important time now in this offseason for the Chicago Bears because in this oasis of OTAs and mini camps, a bunch of salary cap space is about to come their way. $7.2 million of salary cap space officially kicks in tomorrow. It's a part of this June 1st rule that's on the NFL calendar. It's been a part of the offseason process for a long time where when you get to June 1st, they sort of count that as, I guess, sort of the turning point, the changeover point of the offseason, right? Where from a salary cap standpoint, you go from looking back at sort of the previous year and this upcoming year to then future years when it turns over in terms of free agency and player availability. So I believe we're now past the point where the compensatory pick formula no longer is in effect. Everything is locked in for that based on earlier in free agency. And now after June 1st, if you release a player, the dead money that goes on your salary cap is actually then ultimately split across multiple seasons. So prior to June 1st, if you had a player with a big salary cap hit that was going to become dead money, when you cut that player, all of that dead money comes on your books right now. All of the guaranteed money that you already paid them, but you were set to have on your salary cap over the remaining years of his deal, all sort of escalates to now, right? If you're going to try and cut him, you can't, you don't get to keep paying that off in the future. It has to be paid now against your salary cap. But what happens after June 1st is that if you cut a player, you only pay the dead money for this year, 2022, and then next year in 2023, all of the remaining future dead salary cap of guaranteed money goes on the books for 2023. So you save that future money now. You don't have to pay it all right now. You can pay just this year's dead money this year, and then the rest of the future dead money on next year's salary cap when you'll have more cap space available to you when the whole league year restarts. That's when you start to pay those future cap designations. And so what the NFL has done, that's always been part of the offseason equation and process, that June 1st is always that date, throughout longer than I've been alive, certainly, in how NFL teams operate. But I believe it was 2006 is when the league in the collective bargaining agreement added the post June 1st designation in free agency so that a team like the Chicago Bears could cut a player earlier in the offseason, let them become a free agent immediately after being cut, but designate them, just say, hey, we're going to call this player a post June 1st cut so that financially they don't come off of the books until June 1st as though they were a player still under contract but to be cut now. It gives the players the freedom to go sign somewhere else. That the Bears have said, you know what, we're going to cut Tarik Cohen and we're going to cut Danny Trevathan and we're going to designate them post June 1st players. So then Tarik Cohen and Trevathan are free to go sign other contracts with other teams, but the Bears don't get and didn't get at the time that immediate salary cap relief that they might have gotten from cutting them right away. They've had to hold on to their financial, I guess, money owed. The money's already been paid to, but it was still on the Bears' books this entire offseason up to this point. And then after June 1st, that money comes off the books and it's treated as though they were just cut today. So the Bears will still owe the dead money that they would have owed Tarik Cohen and Danny Trevathan this season, but then all of the future dead cap space that they would have had to pay right now if they had released them normally will then go on the books for 2023. And so that difference is $7.2 million in salary cap space that just starting, I guess, tomorrow after this post-June 1st timeline now comes off of the Bears' books. Or really, it's pushed into 2023, but still creates that salary cap space immediately now as part of this financial money moving around that the Bears have. And lo and behold, $7.2 million is quite some space to add more players to this roster that still could use more players. So we'll kind of look at how the money works here with the Tarik Cohen and Danny Trevathan contracts and whether or not maybe other players could be post-June 1st cuts here as well. Next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is powered by our friends at Built Bar, the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars. And every time Built comes out with a great new flavor, I'll tell you what, they do not miss. I've loved everything they put out. I mean, the Built Puffs are great. The brownie batter Built Puffs are phenomenal. They've had these miniature versions of Built Bars, that are Built Bites that are very good. And now they've got Built Bars with granola in them, like Built granola bars come in 3 amazing flavors: chocolate peanut butter, chocolate coconut, and white chocolate berries. You can get a mixed box of all of them right now. And they're like, unlike the sort of like similar type of, chewy candy bar consistency that regular Built Bars have, these Built granola bars have granola inside. So you get a little bit of that crunch in with that chewiness, but still low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. It's a great variation by them. It tastes good. I'm telling you, you got to try them for yourself. You'll fall in love too. Head on over to built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off your order at built.com. The Bears built in this sort of salary cap relief late into this process here in free agency, right away when they made, Tarik Cohen and Danny Trevathan those post-June 1st cuts. Because if you think about it, like adding in that extra $7.2 million of dead cap space right away limited a lot of their ability here to add free agents at wide receiver, for example, or on the offensive line in terms of the amount of money that they wanted to invest at those positions. They didn't invest a lot at cornerback or safety either because financially there just wasn't a ton of salary cap space, and there was not really any way to create much of it responsibly, at least financially responsibly, right away. But what the post-June 1st allows them to do with Cohen and Trevathan is push a little bit of that into the future and make it a little bit more manageable and free up some of that additional space this year rather than having to eat all of that at once. So like you look at Tarik Cohen, for example, right? He had just over $6 million, I think, left on his contract here that he had signed a 3-year, $17.25 million contract. And so they still, this season they would have paid him, I think $5.75 million was going to be that initial salary cap hit, but they were able to then post June 1st, that future guaranteed money on his contract next season, and now have to not only pay that, not pay that now, but pay that into next season and free up quite a large chunk, I think like $3.5 million by making him the post June 1st cut. And the same kind of thing happens with Danny Trevathan, because you might remember under Ryan Pace, what they did with Danny Trevathan's contract extension when they restructured him, and we saw them do this quite a bit with quite a few other players, in order to create immediate salary cap space on those deals. Ryan Pace kept pushing more and more of that guaranteed money into the future. And so with Danny Trevathan, they added on, I think, 3 void years at the end of that contract that spread out when the money was going to be owed on that deal, but to create more of that space in that immediate future. But then when you cut Danny Trevathan, all of that future money owed would have come onto the books right away and essentially reversed what Ryan Pace had done to stretch that money out. And all of a sudden, it made for what would have been, I think, a $4.5 million bill on just the stretched out money beyond what they were already owing Danny Trevathan. And so by making it the post-June 1st cut, you get to mitigate that a little bit, right? You don't stretch it back out to the full 4 years or 3 years extra that Ryan Pace had spread it out. But instead of having 4 years of salary all coming on this year, you can just have just this year's to be dead this year. And then next year, the remaining 3 years that are all a little bit smaller can be consolidated into dead money in 2023. And again, freeing up at least a little bit more of that salary cap space right now to be available. Not that the Bears are trying to make some big, massive win now free agent push, right? Of course, it's been trying to be about being more financially flexible. But by taking on so much of the dead money that they already have, they have room to then make this Tarik Cohen and Danny Trevathan contracts, those post-June 1st hits. And all of a sudden, $7.2 million being freed up literally like within the next 24 hours is going to be a great windfall for them. Because when you think back to like the free agent period that they did have this offseason, of course, we knew it was going to be a little bit more limited in size of the deals they would be able to hand out because there were so many contracts they were going to need to head out. So many holes they had to fill on the defensive line, offensive line, receiver, linebacker, defensive backs, and key backups in depth at so many other positions. So, when you look at like $7.2 million, that's signing another Byron Pringle and another Nick Morrow. That's signing 2 more Al-Qadim Muhammads, right? That's signing Justin Jones and Quick Matt and, DeAndre Houston Carson and Ryan Griffin, right? It's not like you're necessarily going to go land. I mean, I guess you could pool it all and go after one big fish, but you could still, go after another quality wide receiver, another quality offensive lineman, maybe both, fill 2 of those holes with the remainder in free agency. Right? It doesn't seem like the Bears are necessarily in a spot right now to want to go after the big fish. Do they have a motivation to sort of try and go after, the best of what's left, right? Like, for example, I think we think about like a Jarvis Landry at wide receiver as a guy who's, been a name floated out there and around at least. I mean, I know that's not a part of the option anymore, but that style of play, right? Julio Jones or Will Fuller has been floated out there. Some of those bigger wide receivers that maybe might cost a pretty penny of that $7.2 million chunk. That would be a little bit more of a win now type move. And that doesn't seem like exactly where this organization might be. But I think there's still some real quality veteran offensive linemen, some B tier wide receivers that would still be an upgrade over a lot of what the Bears have besides Darnell Mooney. And all of a sudden that 7.2 can go to 2 or 3 players that can upgrade this Bears team at 2 or 3 key spots that might need just, a little bit more. It'd be nice to get a right guard at this point. It'd be nice to get another more proven wide receiver than what they have at this point. And you could always use, I think, more veteran depth on the defensive line, nose tackle with Kyrus Tonga and Angelo Blackson, or 3 technique with Justin Jones and maybe Mario Edwards there, or even a third linebacker next to Nick Morrow and Roquan Smith, right? There's no shortage of places you could start to use $7.2 million of bonus salary cap space that the Bears have just sort of all of a sudden been able to acquire because of these post-June 1st moves that have always been in the cards here for Ryan Poles, right? This has been in his back pocket the entire time. From the moment, in March when they cut Cohen and Trevathan and designated them post-June 1st cuts, this has been on their calendar, and they would know at that time exactly how much cap space would be created for them when they got to June 1st. So I'm surprised that we haven't heard them use that or reference that really at all, in press conferences throughout this offseason of like, hey, when there's questions about, hey, like, are your wide receivers good enough? Are your offensive linemen good enough? Of course, they're going to say, yes, we have faith in our players and the players that we signed, but they could have also maybe said, and, we're going to get $7.2 million in cap space on June 1st, and we'll see what options are available for us, right? It just gives them that flexibility that they could go through the draft, see what they would get at positions of need, and now come out of the draft with extra cap space now, June 1st, to say, okay, we could still draft best player available in the draft, knowing that more cap space would be coming after the draft to potentially fill some holes there. That's why it feels like maybe some kind of small free agent wave could be coming. It's not going to be, 10 players or anything, and maybe it won't be anybody major, but a little bit more quality perhaps than we've seen in the last couple of weeks. Maybe there could be potential trade options there, and we don't even know yet exactly who all is going to be available, because now that it's past June 1st, any player that you cut automatically has their money distributed in that way, where you only have the immediate cap hit for this season and you push future money on. So some teams have waited to this point to make that cut, because you can only designate 2 players as post June 1st cuts all in each offseason until you get to June 1st. And some teams were sort of waiting to see, okay, what would we get in the draft? And now that we get to June 1st, let's cut that player because we were able to find a replacement for him in the draft after all, or let's not cut that player because we couldn't find that replacement in the draft. So we'll look at some of the potential options that could become available that are still under contract for other teams, but might be that June 1st cut candidate next on Locked On Bears. Well, just because we're in June and in one of the dead times of the offseason doesn't mean there isn't plenty of ways you can lay some money down on this upcoming NFL season. And our friends at betonline.net are going to be the number one place for all of your sports betting needs and information. Futures bets are still available for this upcoming season. You got Bears over under 6.5 win total. Bears odds to make the playoffs are a little bit of a long shot. You could bet on where they might finish in the NFC North and so much more. Plus, all the latest odds, news, and sports developments across sports. The basketball playoffs down to the finals. Major League Baseball season in the thick of it. NHL playoffs getting closer and closer to those Stanley Cup finals. Boxing, UFC fights, and so much more. BetOnline is your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, including esports and live betting too. Head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to find out more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. When you look around for potential June 1st casualties for other teams, we're again trying to set expectations properly here, right? That a player that a team releases at this time of year isn't necessarily going to be, a plug and play Pro Bowler, right? They're not all going to be Josh Sitton becoming available at the last minute in September and August or whatever, but it doesn't mean there won't be some pretty quality players, at least upgrades over what the Bears have at some of their positions, or potential upgrades, depending on, how some of these players might pan out. And there's a handful of receivers that seem to jump to the position group that seems to have the most potential availability here. A pair of Patriots receivers, Nelson Aguilar and N'Keal Harry, have both been sort of floated out as possibilities here, right? None of these have been concretely reported that, yes, they will be cut, at least at the time that I'm recording this podcast. But, Aguilar, for example, former Eagles receiver, you might remember, had a pretty good year with the Raiders a couple of seasons ago. He had almost like 800 yards, and it felt like a bounce back for him. So the Patriots brought him in and just didn't really sustain that in New England. So he wouldn't come to Chicago and be some number one or anything, but would be another experienced player with some real production behind him, some drop passes in there too, but some real production behind him that would legitimize that group a little bit more and offer you more proven production than, say, Equanimous St. Brown and Tajay Sharp and some of the other players the Bears have brought in this offseason. Well, N'Keal Harry is more of that first-round bust for the Patriots, who just hasn't really taken that next step and would be more in this vein of guys you take a flyer on just to see, but you don't necessarily set super high expectations. But Aguilar could maybe have slightly greater expectations based on the production that he has shown up to this point in his NFL career. Otherwise, you look around, Darius Slayton from the Giants is another name that's been floated out here, a guy who has had a couple of impressive seasons really early in his career as a fifth-round pick for New York. I think he broke the 700-yard mark a couple of years, was sort of their Darnell Mooney that rookie season, and then trailed off a bit even as their wide receiving core wasn't that great. He struggled to kind of break through there as well, so he could have some real young upside if the Giants moved on and we're just kind of ready to kind of make the change there. And as this new regime is in, I would love to see a flyer on Darius Slayton if he was made available. There's been some rumblings that perhaps the Eagles could make Jalen Reagor available via trade. He was their first-round pick in 2020 and hasn't really been productive for them. And if you trade a player post-June 1st, same salary cap implications as the cut, where the team that trades him doesn't take as much of that dead money on right away, so there's more flexibility for them. But I think the trade compensation for a recent first-round pick like that might be more than the Bears might be willing to give up, given some of Reagor's lack of production up to this point, but still a name that I think is going to be in that conversation if he does. I mean, we don't know whether he's not going to be traded or not, but it's still a name that is up for discussion as far as 4 different wide receivers that could be available as a result of this June 1st rule change. On the offensive line, I think the big one is Isaac Seumalo from the Philadelphia Eagles. He's been a guard for them. I think he might have played some center earlier in his career, though. But in 28 years old, he's been an every-year starter for them, but played 3 games last season with because he had a Liz Frank injury. I think the year before, he only played 9 games. Started every game he's played. It's just he struggled to stay healthy the last couple of years. But it's not like he's a 34-year-old, 36-year-old veteran on the decline. I think the injury concerns are very valid, very real, and a big reason why the Eagles would be so interested in moving on from him. So you wouldn't necessarily want to fully rely on him, but how much can he control the injuries, and how much of that is luck versus legitimate durability questions? I mean, it's certainly questions, but things that are real trends to be concerned about in the future, or just bad luck in a couple of back-to-back seasons. We're not doctors, we don't know, and I don't know if he even knows. I mean, it's impossible to tell, but when healthy, quality starting right guard for the Chicago Bears would be Isaac Seumalo, which I think would be a great situation if the Eagles do indeed make him a post-June 1st cut, as has been speculated, but not reported. A couple of defensive players down in the trenches. D Ford from the 49ers has been a huge disappointment for them. He was really good in Kansas City for a couple seasons, made a Pro Bowl there, got a huge contract, and just busted like crazy in San Francisco. Has not been productive for them at all. It's an extra cheap edge rusher to take a flyer on, but I don't know if we'd be getting our hopes up too much there. But if a Robert Quinn trade is in the future, Ford in the rotation there, never say never. Otherwise, defensive lineman Derek Wolfe from the Baltimore Ravens, they've added some depth on that defensive line. He's more of that 5 technique defensive end, but he could play that 3 technique defensive tackle in a rotation in Chicago. He might want to go somewhere with an even bigger role and probably more money than the Bears might want to offer him after they paid Justin Jones this offseason, but a quality defensive lineman that could become available. And maybe also Dean Lowry from the Green Bay Packers. Similar kind of thing. 5 technique defensive end in their scheme. Played the 4-3 defensive end spot in college at Northwestern, a Rockford native, I believe, local kind of kid. But, I wouldn't count him to come to Chicago and be like an elite pass rusher necessarily, but still on the younger side and good depth on that defensive line. So I think at this point, you can find some potentially new free agent options becoming available for the Bears, and then also more money for them to be able to sign any free agent options that might become available to them. So it just seems like maybe we could be getting it at some sort of another wave here of free agency. Excuse me, that damaged voice is catching up with me after a full podcast here, getting it back in the space. Slowly kind of, you can hear it deteriorating a little bit more, so maybe that's going to be my cue here. I mean, we're wrapping up anyway, but I appreciate you tuning in and following along here on the Locked On Bears podcast. We're here for you all offseason long with your daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. So I hope you'll keep tuning in, keep following along, and keep making Locked On Bears your first listen each and every day. If you want to help out the podcast network here, Locked On Podcast Network, you can help us with a survey we're putting together here for listeners like you to help make your favorite Locked On podcasts even better. It's your opportunity to tell us what you like and don't like about our podcast network. So you can go to lockedonpodcasts.com/survey to get started. It doesn't take very long, and everyone that completes the survey can qualify for a chance to win one of 10 $100 Ticketmaster gift cards. So take the audience survey, lockedonpodcasts.com/survey. survey. Thank you so much for your help. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that my voice sounds better tomorrow, and B, that I hope even with a little bit of a damaged voice here, that the Locked On Bears podcast still makes it easier for you to bear down.